Hey, this is your host, Ron. I'm so glad you could join me for today's Global Vault podcast. The purpose of the podcast is to tell the story of how God is working among the peoples of our world. I look forward to spending the next half hour or so with you. Welcome to the Global Vault podcast. It's good to have you with us for another podcast and a journey together as we talk about what God is doing around the world. Today we have two special guests, Maura and Craig are with us, and we're going to be talking a little bit about their journey in mission and how God has used them and helped them understand what He is doing. So let's just say welcome first to Maura and Craig.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You first met, I'm thinking Regina is kind of a place where things started for you. So Maura, how did you get to Regina and what brought you into that place?
Okay, my family moved to Regina when I was 7 years old. We were living in New Brunswick at the time. And that's where we became acquainted with the Alliance Church, was in Regina. And there, at that time, Canadian Bible College was situated in Regina. And their students were my Sunday school teachers, my Pioneer Girl teachers, my youth leaders, etc. So they became the heroes and heroines in my life, the students at the Bible College. And also because our church was very outreach or missions oriented, we had very good mission conferences that would last for a whole week. And those, as a young person, spoke very, very deeply to my heart. And that's where God really began working in my heart as far as looking overseas or looking to the nations, those that had not heard at a very young age.
So a whole week of a mission conference. So
Yes.
What would be some of the things that would be happening during that week?
We would have special meetings every night. We had special youth meetings. They would be in our Pioneer Girls. We would have like a big missions banquet and then a big final service. And there was also during that time a real push for finances for missions. So that was a very important time too. And I just remember that being a real highlight of our church life and something I really looked forward to. I loved listening to the missionaries tell the stories of what God was doing in the countries where they were working.
So these were missionaries then who were working in a variety of countries around the world, but they'd come back for a short time in Canada, but visit your church.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, Craig, you're a different story. So you have you're an American. We're an American. How did you get from the U.S. to Regina, Saskatchewan?
Okay, let me piggyback on what Maura said just a second, and I'll
Sure.
jump into that. I remember going to one of those conferences when I first arrived in Regina, a missions conference at her home church.
Yeah.
We didn't know each other at the time, and they were raising pledges of money for support of the international workers overseas, and they hadn't gotten to the goal that they wanted. So they started asking people, how many of you would be willing to give 1 month of your salary, whatever job you have, to missions to help us reach the goal for sending out workers? And it became, there were people standing up and offering, I will give a month's salary, and somebody else would say, no, I will give a month's salary, or maybe I can just give 2 weeks, and it became a faith challenge situation where they gave testimonies later of how God enabled them to make up the difference for all of the debts perhaps they had or their family needs and so on. Really exciting time to see God working in a very short period of time.
So just before you go further with that, explain here for our listener, the idea of a pledge offering was what? It was money you didn't have, but in the next 12 months you would trust God to provide
That's right.
$1,000
That's
or
right.
whatever
These
you
people
decided.
would already have been committed to Christ.
Yeah.
They're already tithing and giving offering and above
To
over
their
and above
church,
that.
yeah.
And they're giving sacrificially. So at this point, then, they're saying, all right, if God were to bring into your life some money that you aren't expecting, this is one of the options anyway, would you commit to giving that toward missions?
Okay.
And to others, they say, all right, so can you give a little bit more sacrificially? How about a week's salary, 2 weeks, up to a month, and putting it? So there were various ways of approaching it, but the goal was always to see how God might, in a very special way, intervene to help meet the need.
I was going to just jump in here. That was a huge thing in my faith journey, too.
Okay.
Just to hear the stories, because not only were people giving, but they were explaining how God supplied their needs. This was at the end of the month, after they had given that money and they had of their month's salary, how God had supplied that need in incredibly unexpected ways. And also how he kept their expenses down. That was another way.
Sure, yeah.
So
yeah,
it was
yeah.
an incredible
Yeah,
faith-building time. And
Yeah.
I just remember someone sitting on the platform with their little calculator, putting in all the amounts, and it was just, woo!
Yeah.
It was exciting.
Yeah. So kids were doing this too, young people?
Yeah, but I was really young at the time, so I remember our family stories.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
our family doing that. I mean, my dad doing that.
Yeah.
And so that really impacted my life.
Okay, yeah. So the American.
Oh yeah, I graduated from high school at the height of the Vietnam War. So all of us guys in my class, and this was in the Seattle area,
Yep.
and knew that the next 4 years of our lives were planned by the military. We would be drafted, conscripted, and so I wasn't planning to go on to university because I knew that within a few months I would be in the military. But I loved the water, so I figured I'd rather go into the Navy than in the Army. So I graduated, went down to the Navy recruiting station, signed up for, got the physical and took the IQ test and all this kind of stuff. And was approved. And they said, well, you've got a good job, which I did at that time. You just continue to work until your draft notice arrives in the mail. And then you come down here and you'll be in the Navy rather than the Army. I thought, well, that's cool. I'll get to be on the water.
Yeah.
Little did I know, anyway. So I was in a little country church, and the volunteer youth sponsors, the man said, I spent some time in the military. I think if you are planning on being in for 4 years, or in my case, I was planning on a career in the military.
Oh, okay.
So you go for 20 years, and then you can retire. And I thought, man, that'd be cool. 38 years of age, I could retire and start a whole nother career.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, instead of 4 years, I'll just stay in. And he said, if you're planning on a career, I think you should get 1 year of Bible school before you go in. Now, I was following Christ at this time, but I had no intentions on a ministry career at all. And so I said, well, I'll pray about it, and I'll put a fleece out. Because the guys in those years had two ways of getting out of the military. One was to skip across to Canada to be a draft dodger. The other was to go to pretend to be a minister and get a conscientious objection qualification just to get out of the military. And I had no intentions of either, but I thought this would be a great fleece. I will apply for a 1-year student deferment, and I'll tell them I want to go to a Bible school in Canada. I figure that'll set them off right away.
Yeah.
And the other one was in there too. It's a Bible school rather than university. And so I applied to CBC, was accepted, took that application to the draft board, and they changed my classification. Unbeknownst to me, there was a person, the leader of the draft board, who had evidently at one time attended an Alliance church, not a believer, but felt that if there's anyone sincere in wanting to go into ministry, it would be a young man from the Alliance church.
Okay.
So they met and changed my classification from 1A, which means ready to go, qualified, to 4D. I had applied for what they call a 2S, student deferment, 1 year. And when the notice came back, it said 4D. And that meant you're already a pastor, you're never eligible to be drafted in your life. And I was shocked. So I went to the youth sponsor and I said to him, these guys, look what they've done. They've ruined my career plans.
Your career in the military shot.
And he said, did you pray about it? And I said, yes. He said, did God answer? Well, I said, look what they've done. And he said, well, go for 1 year. And if you want to get back into the military, you won't retire until you're 39. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And apply for them to change you back to 1A status. So I went. That's how I ended up in Regina. Number one, it was cheaper than going to Bible school in the States, and it was an adventure. Plus, it was my fleece. I figured if they're going to negate something, this will certainly set them off.
Yeah.
But it didn't.
It didn't.
So I went for 1 year. At the end of the first year, they wrote me a letter, the military, the U.S. military, and they said, go for a second year. And so I went back for a second year. And so I figured, all right, after this year, then I can get back into the military. At the end of the second year, they wrote again, and they said, go for a third year. So this is why I say it was the U.S. military that sent me to CBC in Regina.
Of all places, yes.
I went to the third year. During that third year, I had been elected as president of the Student Missions Society, where we had to plan the Friday evening service for the students and faculty every week. Maura happened to be on that committee. Both of us, during that third year, at least in my case, during that third year, God changed my priorities and goals in life. And I applied to be a candidate for as a missionary with the Alliance. She did so also. We were not dating or anything at the time. We did it separately. But it was a change in priorities in my life. And after that third year, the military didn't write back. So I went back for the fourth year and graduated with a Bachelor of Theology with a major in missions. And they kept me there long enough to get my priorities straight.
Yeah. That's quite the story. Yeah.
At the end of that third year, we began dating.
Yeah.
She graduated, went into nurses training, and then the rest was history for us.
Going. So you were watching this American guy coming up. Like, what did you see in him?
That's a very good
Go,
question.
Mara, go.
How long an answer do you want?
Yeah, we have time.
Both of us were on, as Craig said, on the missions council. You know, it's very interesting because I think probably the school at that time did a lot of what parents do. When kids are rambunctious and tend to get in trouble, they give them a lot of responsibility to keep them busy.
Okay, yes. Good strategy,
I think that's why Craig and I were on different committees
Lots
to
to
keep
do.
us out of trouble.
Yeah.
But it was during that third year that we got to know each other. And I was in charge of the prayer ministry for overseas work. And Craig, as he said, led the team, the missions team. But it was during that year that I noticed Craig's heart for God and for the nations and for the world. And he was a leader, but he was a very unique leader in that he wasn't up front all the time. He was a quiet leader, but he encouraged others to take responsibility and to take the lead and to be up front. And I just really appreciated that in him. So that was one of the many things I saw in him.
Yeah. Well, so that as you then came together and decided to sort of focus on missions, how did Latin America come into the picture? That was your destination eventually there as candidates?
Well, at that time, the Alliance required 1 year of a master's level studies prior to going overseas. So she graduated from nurses training 1 week. The next week we were married, and the following week we moved to Chicago, and I began studies at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School there. And we got into a study program that was longer than 1 year. Latin America was not particularly on our radar, but we applied open with the Alliance. In other words, when we were qualified, when we finished studies and ordination and all of these kinds of things, then they would ask us where we offer the opportunities. So the choices were three, and I didn't happen to be home when they called, and Maura got to actually make the choice. One was Japan.
Phew!
Yeah.
One was Japan, one was the Philippines, and one was an urban center in Latin America, which was Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Oh, okay.
And she made the decision right there on the phone while I was at work somewhere else.
Yeah, not knowing what were these
I had
three
no
things
idea what
or
part of the
anything.
world it was going to be.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it became Argentina, and we went then to Central America for language study in Costa Rica for 1 year, and then on to Argentina.
Yeah. So talk a little bit then about language. So Spanish would have been that language. Now, how easily did you pick that up? Like when a person thinks of having to learn another language, that's a scary thing. So you had a 1 year on a scale of 1 to 10. What would you have been, say, by the end of that year?
Well, that's your initial study.
Yeah.
And then you have 2 more years on the field. But I mean, you're always learning. You are always learning the language. They say Spanish is one of the easiest languages. So I'm glad I had that one because I did not find it all that easy.
Yeah.
And the thing I found difficult when we went to Costa Rica for the language study is that you come from a fairly successful ministry or whatever you're doing, and all of a sudden you're plunked into a situation where you cannot communicate. So you feel like you're a 2-year-old in an adult body. So I remember going to the market and thinking, okay, I have to buy all my groceries in Spanish.
Yeah.
We didn't even have any Spanish when we first went. So how are we going to do this? So you draw pictures, you talk with your hands, you do all kinds of motions, and you make all kinds of mistakes. And you just realize, you know what? You're going to learn to laugh at yourself because you are going to make a lot of mistakes. And unless you try, you're never going to learn. So I remember one time calling the cemetery. We went to the cemetery. They're
Yes.
going, what?
Yeah.
But you make lots of mistakes. You learn to laugh at yourself. But the people know that you love them. You need to learn the language to communicate, but you also need to have a love for the people because you can be very proficient in the language. And if you don't love the people, they know.
They know, yeah.
So both are very important.
Yeah. And learning the language then also sets you apart from tourists who are sort of just in and out for a short time, but it's like you've made an effort.
You've made an effort, and the people love
They
the
know
fact
that.
Because they know you're just learning, they love the fact that you are trying, that is important to you to be able to communicate with them in their language.
Yeah.
Language learning is probably one of the key differences between career missions and short-term missions. Short-term can do projects, and they can do them well. They're usually short, very short. But without being able to communicate at a heart level, the impact will always be less than if you could communicate in their own language and deal, counsel or preach or teach in that language also.
Yeah. Well, so then you would start at out of 10, 5 or 6 or 7, and then eventually you get to 8 or 9 or something like that, where you could preach and teach fluently.
One of my first assignments upon arrival was to teach Greek in Spanish, and the other was hermeneutics.
Okay.
And I felt so bad for those students because it was a great learning experience for me in language, and it was a horrible experience for those
them.
students in trying to. It was tough enough to learn Greek, but to learn it from someone who's just learning the language, Spanish, it was very difficult. But you're right; it's a gradual improvement of communication skills that it just increases with the assignments.
I can imagine those students, they're probably still talking about you. Like,
Oh,
this
yes.
guy came down from Canada, tried to teach
around
us
the
Greek.
campfires.
What's happening around the
They love
campfires?
to tell all these stories of the mistakes that missionaries made in language, and some of them are on us.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and they just roar with laughter
Yeah.
and have a good time.
Let's talk about Argentina here. So, I don't know, where's Argentina? I think of it as Latin America, but are there some things you can talk about it? That was sort of the destination, and then we should get to where did you live and what did you do there?
Sure. Well, Argentina. If you cut Latin America, South America, let's say, if you cut South America in half horizontally, right through the middle, most of what's left at the bottom is Argentina and Chile. Buenos Aires is the capital city. Okay. It's a long flight from Calgary or Regina, anywhere up here, down to Buenos Aires because it's probably a 7 or 8 hour flight. It's a long haul. Beautiful city. Argentina is a bit of Europe in South America. It was receiving immigrants the same time Canada was, and a lot of the people there came from the same roots that we came from up here.
Oh.
Half would get off the boat in Canada. The other half would continue on and get off the boat maybe in Argentina. So a lot of Eastern European background people. And in the history, a sad history for Argentina is that the original population was pretty well wiped out in the wars that they had back a couple hundred years ago. And so Argentina became sort of Europe down there, all immigrants. And the language is Spanish, but with an Italian twang to it, an accent, and a special declension of verbs that's unique to Argentina simply because of the Italian influence. The largest ethnic group in Argentina is Italian. Second is Spanish, third German. So it was a hard audience. They brought the European resistance to the gospel right along with them when they immigrated. And so life in the big city was interesting, but we'd already had a number of years in Chicago by this time, so it wasn't as much a challenge as it would have been if we'd gone straight from Regina.
So when we think of then the purpose of mission, what was the purpose of, say, the mission or the sending agency you were with? What were they trying to accomplish in Argentina?
At that time, it was church planting and theological education. So we got involved immediately in church planting as well as education. And our first assignment was 2 bus rides away. It took us an hour and a half to get there, carrying a little 2-year-old with us. The next assignment was in a community close to us. And working in the Bible college there, the Bible Institute, took a lot of time for the first couple of years. And then we began moving more exclusively into church planting. So leadership training along with
So the church is already established, and so there's leaders emerging, and so you're giving them their theological background, theological education. The church planting, then, what does that mean?
Well, one of the prime examples that we had was Canada initiated a focus on Buenos Aires back in the 80s and funded it, which was part of the famous Encounter with God programs of Latin America. And Buenos Aires was one that Canada decided to focus on. And so we were directing that program. And the idea was to plant churches, in this case from scratch, from zero. Just go rent a little storefront and start promoting and inviting people in. And it's much more difficult doing it that way than with a core group that's borrowed from someone else. But we didn't have that opportunity. So the Encounter with God project all through Latin America included Argentina, and the Canadian Alliance raised $1 million for that, to buy properties, put up buildings, and try and get something going that would be capable of reproducing itself throughout the country. So we got involved in that.
Okay. So then, how many years were you then in Argentina?
Overall, with language study in Costa Rica, it was a 16-year assignment.
Yeah. So then the focus switched towards this other canal project.
Yes.
Can you go into that? What is canal, and what were the desired outcomes there?
I was asked to do a 3-year teaching rotation at CTS, the seminary in Regina, which is where when we left Argentina, went to Regina for 3 years, taught there for that rotation, and we knew we were not going back to Argentina.
Oh, okay.
And in 1996, there was an assembly, Canadian Assembly in Regina, where a key decision was made. Canada wanted to do a joint project with a third world national church in some part of the world where neither had any experience, so they'd be on equal footing. And that's how the Canal Project began. A decision was taken in 96 at Assembly. We were asked to coordinate that project, and we came up with the name Canal because CAN, canal is something like a channel where you move resources, human, financial, whatever, from one place to another. And it had the advantage of CAN standing for Canada and AL for America Latina, which is Latin America. So it was just a catchy term, but it also had symbolism in terms of the moving. So Latin America, some of the national churches had become quite strong and realized that they had an obligation to be involved in missions. It was a little slow, and one of the comments that I heard one time in a conference was that the missionaries in Latin America had done a phenomenal job in all kinds of ministries, but two. And in those two areas, they hadn't done real well. One was teaching them how to give, and the other one was teaching them how to go. And so we were trying to pick up our socks on both of those with the Canal Project. Okay. So the goal was to take these churches that wanted to start getting involved in sending their own people and get them prepared, get them trained, help the national churches, the local churches to know how to finance their people and how to actually deploy them. And the goal was, once they're ready, then they would join with some Canadian international workers that were also going to be deployed to an area where neither had any experience.
Okay, yeah. So it's new to both. Yeah, equal
And
footing.
that's where North Africa came in.
Okay.
The northern part of the Sahara was an area where neither Canadian nor any other of the Alliance national churches had any experience. And so the two teams were going to join and focus there.
Okay, yeah. So then when you think of Latin America then, so I mean there was, what, half a dozen national bodies. So were these people from each country or different countries, or primarily which country, or what was the idea of that coming together?
We did a tour of 5 countries where the national presidents all said, yes, we have young people coming to us saying that God is calling them into missions, but we're not prepared to send them.
Okay.
Can you help us? And so we worked with those 5 initially.
So these are like Ecuador, Peru,
Yes, Chile, Argentina,
yeah,
and there were other candidates who were calling from Brazil and Bolivia, Venezuela, some other places where the national churches were not always real strong. So we moved at this time back to Latin America then. We moved to Ecuador. We were there for 6 years, and the whole time we were there was working with national churches and candidates, trying to get the launching pad ready and get the candidates ready with their corresponding churches. So some of them could not send candidates on their own financially, so they came up with a cool idea that a couple of countries would get together and they would say, all right, you've got a prime candidate, well prepared, ready to go. We will raise 20% of the funding here in this country, and you guys, you don't have much money. If you can raise 10%, that'll be good. And they started sharing the costs around so they could send one family from a third country. Maybe.
Yeah.
It was very creative, and it worked.
Yeah. So then at the other end, they got to North Africa, and how did they settle there, or what was the strategy?
The very first that we sent was a single girl from Venezuela, one of the smallest national churches in South America, but with vision. She was already a translator in a couple of languages. She learned Arabic in North Africa and was in that area full-time studying and working for 2 years. But she was engaged when she went, and so she then left. But that sending helped the Latin American churches realize, hey, this is something we can do. And we know we've got a little experience now. And so Canal, at that point, had other candidates ready to go. And the Alliance World Fellowship Latin American Division was ready to pick up the responsibility. So we took all the candidates that we had ready, and we turned them over to the Alliance World Fellowship down there, and they immediately sent a family from Colombia, from Bogota. And that family went to another place in North Africa and became very effective and are still working with people from North Africa now, even though they had to leave that country and are now ministering in Europe.
So it was a good opportunity for Latin American countries to also engage in mission. And even though they may have been short on funds or people, yet the idea of partnering and coming together
Absolutely
solved that for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that their doing that woke them up to even a broader spectrum of opportunities where their responsibility could kick in. So they began sending to other parts of the world also.
Yeah, yeah. Is there a way to estimate how many international workers from this group would be out there somewhere?
Some of them, the national churches were not fast enough to send them, and so they ended up going with other agencies, and they're doing a good job in a number of very difficult places of the world. Number-wise, I really don't have a good grasp on that, but I know that we have workers from probably at least 6 different countries in Latin America
that are engaged, yeah.
in different parts of the world.
Yeah. Do you have some stories on a divine encounter?
Oh, absolutely.
Give us one. Couple.
Something very interesting started happening as soon as this canal project focused on North Africa. And I have a pet theory. It's not all that theological, but the theory is that God will go to any extent to get people to focus on parts of the world where no one is working, because he loves those people and he deserves to be glorified by their changed lives, North Africa being a key location. And so in our very first time into North Africa, we weren't experienced there. We were visiting a couple of countries and we got lost. And here's a very simple God encounter experience, because God still saves the lost.
Yeah, and you were one of them.
We were there. We got into a city where I had a map. We arrived by train, began walking around, and I thought, we're in good shape because I can find my way around pretty well. And on the train ride up there, we met a tour guide, and he talked to us in a number of different languages. So it was enjoyable meeting him, but he was hungry. He got off the train in another city, and we thought we'll never see him again. So we went on up to another hour to another city, got off the train, got into a little hotel, went out walking, got lost. Because it got dark, the streets were like hubs on a wheel, and the map didn't work because the language on the map was different than the street signs. All of a sudden, we noticed that they were all in Arabic, and the map was in French, and it wasn't helping at all.
No.
We wandered around trying to find our way back to this hotel for several hours, and I'm feeling very guilty. I'm taking my wife on this wild goose chase in a potentially dangerous area. It's dark, it's spooky, and we haven't a clue where we are nor how to get back to where we need to be. And so behind us were walking 3 girls on their way home from somewhere, and they were a little nervous about some guys walking behind them, so they ran to catch up with us and soon realized their mistake, because Maura then had a plan of how we could ask them how to find our way back to a hotel which is next to a train station. So why don't you tell them what happened?
Well, because we at that point didn't speak either Arabic or French.
Yeah.
So these girls come up, and I wanted to ask them how to get to our hotel. Well, we had picked a hotel that was right beside the train station, so that it was easy with their suitcase, it was easy to find, etc. So I asked her where the hotel was, but I go, how do I ask her? So I go, I can't ask her about the hotel, I have to ask her about the train station. So I go, choo-choo! And she looked at me like I'd lost my marbles.
That's right, yes.
I guess trains don't do that there.
No, they're not a train.
So what
They're
happens
electric,
is these girls feel that they might be, they pointed in one direction, they went in another.
Oh.
I think they thought they were probably maybe safer away from us.
They were safer with the boys than they were with us.
You, yeah,
So we began walking more, and I realized it's time to pray. And it was one of these Nehemiah kinds of prayers, really short and to the point. Dear God, help. We are lost.
Okay.
We walk up to the very next corner, and up roars a little motorcycle, with 2 guys on it. The guy in the back jumps off, runs over to us, and he's all excited to see us, because this is the guy that got off the train in that other city.
In the other city.
And he had gotten something to eat, got back on the train, came up to the city where we were, met up with a friend. They're just tooling around having fun, and he spots us on this corner.
Yeah.
And this was here's an angel
Yeah, really.
that God sent. And he says, what are you guys doing here? And we were more excited to see him, actually.
What are you doing here?
And he says, he told us his story, and he says, oh, you can't find your way to the hotel? See this avenue here? And we're way down there, about 10 blocks, it bends. When you get down to that curve, if you look way down, you'll see where the train station is. Your hotel is next to it. And he jumped back on the motorcycle and was gone. We never saw him again. But it was one of those cases where, in an instant, God hears your prayer.
Yeah, yeah.
And answers in a way that, it's kind of stupid, actually, to get lost in a situation like that.
No, but you don't know, right? You're out there and you're moving
But God
along.
cares about these little details in our life.
Yeah.
And that was a God encounter that we never forgot, because we got lost on other occasions too. And it also worked on other occasions, but that was one of them.
Yeah.
And it also showed us that God was interested in our survival and to move things forward in that part of the world. There were a number of situations like that. As a matter of fact, I don't think that in our experience in the 16 years prior, nor after we left North Africa, that we had anywhere near the quantity of these unusual God encounter type situations as we did during that period of time. That's why I go back to my pet theory. God was focused on making sure that people would stay and try to move wheels forward in a part of the world that's least reached, that has least access to the gospel. And he goes to unusual lengths to make it happen. Yeah. Dreams, visions, healing miracles, things that sound like they're directly out of the book of Acts, like the story of Cornelius. I know of people where they came to Christ because in a dream they were directed to another town, to a specific address, and someone answered the door, and they asked, they said, you've got some information that I need. And that person would share Christ with that person. And this was the beginning of their spiritual journey with Christ. These kinds of things are quite common in North Africa. And so that's what my theory is. I'm sticking to it.
Well, I think let's do, if you have one more story, let's do it. But it is the idea that where the gospel yet hasn't arrived, as in some of the countries where there's a longer history, the gospel is planted, but in these other areas, God shows up in just different ways, trying to get the attention of people. And like you say,
let me tell one more,
one
real quickly.
more.
Our oldest son decided he heard about these stories, and we're still making trips into North Africa, haven't yet moved there. And he was in the Marines in the States, and he gets out and he says, Dad, if I can catch up with you on the next trip, can I accompany you? And he had several motives, but one of them was, he says, I'm curious about these God encounter things that happen there. And so we traveled together for a month, and he had three big concerns in his life that we were praying about. He would lead devotions one night, I'd lead the next night, and we had just a great time as I were going to meetings in different countries. So he had three concerns. First of all, he was in love. He had this girl he wanted to marry, and he wanted to know, how do I know for sure God's leading in this? And if we're going to get married, how long should we wait before we get married? Yeah. Big issue. Secondly, he was just getting out, and he was going back to school, wanted to major. What am I going to major in? Career focus. And third was basically a job. He needed a job. Yeah. So three big things that we prayed about pretty much every day for a month. Well, we went through a lot of experiences together in meetings, and as a matter of fact, that was the first time that I was with you and Myra in Malta. He was with us. And anyway, the last night that we're together, we are back out of North Africa into Spain at a YWAM guest house in Malaga, Torremolinos, and I've gone to bed or up to the room. He's up late down talking to the guys when there's a knock on the door, and it's an elderly gentleman who stops by and had a letter to drop off to somebody. And Tim went to the door, answered, and said, hello, my name is Tim Bundy, sticks out his hand. The guy shakes his hand, and he won't let loose. He says, Tim Bundy. he says, that reminds me of some advice that a man gave to me 30 years ago. And while he's holding on to his hand, he shares this advice with him. He said, oh, yeah, I've got this letter I need to drop off. Can you put it in their box? And then he was gone. Tim comes up later and he says, Dad, he said, weirdest experience. He said, this guy dropped off the stuff and gave me some advice. But anyway, he didn't think a whole lot about it. And the next morning, we're getting on the plane in Malaga to go back to wherever. And this guy gets in line behind us. Oh. And he introduces himself to me. And he said, did you ever have a family member that was a missionary in Latin America? Way back. And I thought about it and I said, well, I had a great uncle, brother to my paternal grandfather who worked in Central America. He said, what country? And I said, in Guatemala. And he said, what was his name? I said, his name was Frank Bundy. But I said, he's dead. He retired years ago and he's long gone. And he said, Frank Bundy. He says, that's the guy. He said, when I was arriving on the field in Guatemala as a young man, he was leaving. He was retiring. And on his way out, he gave me 3 pieces of advice. And he says, I just passed those on to his great nephew. For Tim, it was a sort of a serendipitous hug from God saying, you know, if you seek my face, and if your heart is inclined in the right direction, I can find you anywhere.
Isn't that something?
At any time of day or night to direct your life. Now, the advice that he had to give him didn't correspond to his 3 big issues. He didn't tell him whether to marry this girl or not, nor what he should focus on. But it was a message down through time saying, I love you. And just keep committed to me, and I will direct in your life. Now, the 3 pieces of advice were very interesting, but not germane to his future.
But it was still kind of this unique thing that
for him, it was a God encounter.
It was, and in a place that you wouldn't have expected.
In a place where he would never, at a time of day that was weird, and he was watching for this, and God gave him his divine encounter. Right after we get out of North Africa. So he's never been back, but it always makes me emotional to think, you know, God in his love for each one of us and for all of those people over there will go to any length to accomplish his purposes.
He can do anything and he's not limited in any way. That's a great story. Okay, well, we should wind down here. Thanks, Samora and Craig, for being with us on this Global Vault podcast, and for you as a listener. I hope you're encouraged also that God can find you wherever you are and speak in a variety of ways. So we'll be back in 2 weeks to take another podcast. May God go with you.
Hi, this is Suresh from Toronto. Thank you for checking out the Global Vault podcast. And for more information on the Global Vault, including more episodes and resources, please visit our website at globalvault.ca. Ushakal.